We continue to get more numbers that indicate that U.S. economic activity is really starting to slow down. According to Challenger Gray and Christmas, the number of layoffs in the United States was 38% higher in August than it was in July. A 38% increase in 1 month is more than just a little bit startling. And many believe that if this momentum continues, we could soon be facing an avalanche of job losses similar to what we witnessed in 2008. And without a doubt, all of the other economic numbers that have been rolling in lately also confirm that the U.S. economy is heading into harder times. But is our country ready to handle another major economic downturn? Even though there have been moments of difficulty over the past decade, we truly haven't seen anything like this since the last financial crisis. In fact, the latest job cut numbers that we just got from Challenger Gray and Christmas are the highest that we have seen during any August since 2009. Job cuts rose 38% over July, with 53,480 positions to be slashed from employer payrolls, led by workforce reductions in healthcare, which had been a mainstay of recent job creation, the tech sector, and manufacturing. So why is this happening? Well, certainly there are many factors at play, but Andrew Challenger has singled out the trade war as one of the biggest reasons. Employers are beginning to feel the effects of the trade war and imposed tariffs by the US and China. Other nations are really starting to feel the effects of the trade war as well. This week, Germany reported a startling drop in new manufacturing orders. Contracts for made-in-Germany goods fell 2.7% from the previous month in July. Data showed on Thursday, driven by a big drop in bookings from non-Eurozone countries, the economy ministry said. That undershot a Reuters consensus forecast for a 1.5% drop. The misery in manufacturing continues. The decline in new orders significantly increases the risk of a recession for the German economy, Vice President bank analyst Thomas Gitzel said. During the second quarter, German GDP growth fell into negative territory, and it looks like that will happen again here in the third quarter. That would mean that Germany is already in a recession right now, and that is very troubling news for all of Europe. Here in the US, just about everything that we would expect to see happen just prior to the beginning of a financial crisis is happening in textbook fashion right in front of our eyes. In particular, the transportation industry is already mired in a very deep downturn. And we just learned that orders for heavy trucks that haul part of the economy's goods across the U.S. plunged by 80.1% in August 2019 compared to August last year, to about 10,400 orders, according to preliminary estimates by FTR Transportation Intelligence. It was the 10th month in a row of year-over-year declines, and the second month in a row of 80% plus declines, with orders in July having plunged 81.2% to about 9,800, not seen since 2010. I don't know about you, but an 80% decline sure seems like an awfully big red flag to me. Overall, it's still being projected that the U.S. economy will stay out of contraction territory in the third quarter, but GDP forecasts have continued to slip. The following comes from Reuters. The U.S. economy is likely growing at a 1.7% annualized rate in the third quarter, based on weaker than forecast data on domestic manufacturing activity and construction spending. The Atlanta Federal Reserve's GDP Now forecast model showed on Tuesday. This was slower than the 2% pace estimated by the Atlanta Fed's GDP program on August 30th. In the end, any number above zero for the third quarter should be considered a big victory in this global economic environment. But even if we eke out slight growth in the third quarter, nobody should be using the word booming to describe our economy. In fact, we haven't been booming for a very, very long time. We haven't had a full year when U.S. GDP grew by at least 3% since the middle of the Bush administration, and at this point nearly 40% of the nation struggles to pay for the basics. Many people still struggle to pay bills, even for something as basic as food. That's the difficult conclusion of a new report released this week by the Urban Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy group based in Washington, D.C., which surveyed almost 7,600 adults last December. Some 39.4% of adults said their families had trouble meeting at least one basic need for food, healthcare, housing, or utilities last year. The gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow in our country, and that has dire implications for our future. If those with money and power continue to have a let-them-eat-cake attitude about all of this, eventually we will see chaos in our streets. And this is something that a mayor hack recently discussed. How can the economy be strong when 40% of people are struggling to eat? Isn't that a little bit like the Hunger Games actually coming to life? Is that where America is now? What on earth? Think about the fact itself for a second before we discuss it. 40% of the people in the world's richest country struggle to afford food. It's a let-them-eat-cake moment happening before our eyes. How much more Versailles can you get? There's nothing more basic than being able to afford food. When a society can't provide food for its people, it's one of the most severe and fundamental indicators that something's badly wrong. What happens when people can't eat anymore? I'll come back to that. The truth is that the economy isn't strong. It's not even so-so. It's so weak that it's collapsing. Look, let me recite the now familiar litany of statistics that I so often do. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The majority have no savings. Hence, 70% can't even raise $1,000 for an emergency. The middle class has collapsed as incomes haven't risen in decades, but inequality has. 50 million Americans live in technical poverty, more than the population of Canada or most European countries. Longevity is plummeting by a year, every year. Suicide, depression, skyrocketing as people give up on the future. The expectation is that life will only get worse for future generations. Now, add to all that the brutal, unreal, horrific fact that 40% of people can't afford food. But that's not all this latest research said. 40% struggle to afford health care. 50% struggle to find a decent job with good wages. 35% are falling behind on bills. 40% struggle to pay off their credit cards. Shocking. Alarming, but not surprising to anyone that's a regular American, not living in a cloistered Beltway ivory tower. Look, let's translate those statistics into plain English. Americans now face endemic, systemic, chronic poverty, hunger, misery, illness, powerlessness, and a lack of basic safety. That's not a joke. It's not an overstatement. It's a hard reality. Somewhere between 40 to 80% of them, which is a colossal number, hundreds of millions of people larger than the populations of Canada and most European countries, face such lives every single day now. That is statistical reality. Nobody much discusses it. Why not? Is that another failure? Have you ever wondered why public discourse doesn't reflect your reality? So why this constant myth that the economy is strong? Why would anyone with eyes and a brain believe such an obviously foolish thing? Well, the first thing to understand is that it is a myth, not just a little one, but a gigantic one of the most fundamental ones. When suicide is skyrocketing, when people can't afford to feed their families, when half a society says they can't find a decent job, the economy isn't doing well, but as long as you believe it is, then it's your fault if you're struggling. It's not your fault. It can't be your fault if you're struggling when close to half a society is having trouble eating. That's a social problem. It points to a terrible, epic, systemic failure in the absence of a giant famine. Let me make that even clearer. Hunger, poverty, misery, and inopportunity are not a strong economy. They are a weak one. In fact, they represent a collapsing one. If they are new things, like they are in America, it's a bizarre fantasy to think so. If hunger, poverty, misery, and inopportunity are a strong economy, what on earth could be a weak one? Nearly half of Americans are struggling to feed their kids. Chronic, systemic, endemic hunger, poverty, misery, powerlessness, and illness now characterize American life. But when the Hunger Games actually come to life, that's not a strong economy. It's a dystopia. So where does this bizarre, astonishing, spectacular fantasy that makes the rest of the world shake its head in horrified disbelief, the economy is strong, while 40% of people can't afford to feed their families, come from? What does it tell us? It comes from the fact that, as many of you know by now, Americans' economic statistics don't represent the economy anymore. The indicators that American thinking relies on, the stock market, GDP, the unemployment rate, only really tell us about the health of capitalism. They don't tell us anything whatsoever about how well people are doing. It's perfectly feasible for GDP, which is the sum of profits, and the stock market, which is tomorrow's profits, counted today. As a result, you get this incredibly bizarre, weird, and grotesque picture. The stock market's booming, GDP's growing, but 40% of Americans can't afford to eat. What the? Did you see shades of Versailles in that? Shades of Soviet collapse? You should. It's predatory growth. Americans are growing hungry, they are growing poor, and they're getting ill. Precisely because the ultra-rich are preying on them, or maybe deluding them into preying on each other, dangling little rewards before them, just like so many times before in history. And now, it appears that we are heading into a new economic collapse, and many believe that the economic pain that we will experience will be even greater than what we experienced during the last financial crisis.